August 14th, 1867, Union County, South Carolina. Marcus Johnson stood on the church porch, rifle in one hand, Bible in the other, watching 60 torches approach through the darkness. The same men who had been lynching freed people for sport were coming for him now. What happened in the next hour would be erased from every history book for the next 150 years. Because when those doors kicked open, everything white America believed about power race and violence shattered. They could not let you know that black soldiers did not just fight the KKK. They absolutely crushed them. Wait, let me start over. Because what I just told you, that is not even the story we are covering today. That is just one example of what they have hidden from you. Today, we are talking about something even bigger. Something that explains why your family does not own property. Why you do not have generational wealth. Why the gap between black and white wealth in America is not just big, it is astronomical. And it is not because your ancestors did not work hard enough. It is because they did work hard. They built empires. They became millionaires, and then white supremacy burned it all to the ground and erased every record of it ever existing. By the end of this video, you will know the exact number of black millionaires who were murdered and erased in 24 hours. You will see how the United States government used airplanes to bomb American citizens on American soil and covered it up for 75 years. You will understand the direct line from 1921 to your bank account today, and you will never accept the wealth gap as just how things are ever again. This is not ancient history. People alive today had parents who survived this massacre. Your poverty is not your fault. It was stolen from you. And I can prove it with names, dates, numbers, and bodies. They are still digging up right now. If your grandparents or great-grandparents lived anywhere in Oklahoma, Arkansas, or Texas, this directly affected your family's wealth. This is your stolen inheritance. And after 75 years of silence, the truth is finally coming out. So let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why your family does not have a house that was passed down? Why there is no family business that your grandfather built? Why there is no land that has been in your family for generations? You were told it is because black people did not save money, because we spent it all, because we did not plan for the future. That is a lie. Your ancestors did save, they did build, they did plan, and it was stolen, burned, destroyed, erased. Let me show you how. June 1st, 1921, 5:30 in the morning, Greenwood District, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Dr. Andrew Jackson stands on the balcony of his hospital. His hospital, not white-owned, not white-funded, his. He built it with his own hands and his own money. He is looking out over 35 city blocks of the most successful black community in America. They call it Black Wall Street, and it is not just a nickname. It is accurate. 300 black-owned businesses, 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, 2 newspapers, a library, 13 churches, 6 private airplanes, and over 300 millionaire families. Not millionaires by today's standards. Millionaires in 1921 dollars. That is the equivalent of having 15 to 20 million today. Dr. Jackson watches the sun rise over Greenwood Avenue. The street is quiet. In a few hours it will be full of life. Black people walking to black-owned banks, shopping at black-owned stores, getting their hair cut at black-owned barbershops, eating at black-owned restaurants. Every single dollar circulating 36 to 100 times within the community before leaving Greenwood. Compare that to today, where a black dollar leaves the black community in 6 hours. 6 hours. Back then, it stayed for weeks. That is how you build wealth. That is how you create generational prosperity. That is what your great-great-grandparents understood and what has been stolen from you. Dr. Jackson hears birds singing. He hears the first streetcar of the day rattling down the tracks. He smells breakfast cooking from the houses below. He feels pride, not arrogance. Pride. The kind of pride that comes from building something from nothing. Because 40 years earlier, his parents had been slaves. 40 years, 1 generation and a half, from slavery to this. Think about that. Your great-great-grandparents went from being property to owning property worth millions in 40 years, while being terrorized by the KKK, while being denied loans, while being blocked from white schools and white jobs. They did it anyway. They built an empire, and white America could not tolerate it. Dr. Jackson hears a sound that does not belong. A siren, then another. He sees smoke rising from the south end of Greenwood. Black smoke, thick. He smells kerosene. Then he sees something that makes his blood freeze. An airplane, flying low, too low. It banks over Greenwood Avenue and something falls from it. A bottle. It tumbles through the air, trailing liquid. It hits the roof of Gurley Hotel and explodes into flames. Then another plane, and another. 6 planes total, all dropping bombs. Homemade bombs filled with gasoline and turpentine. The roofs are catching fire. The buildings are made of brick, but the roofs are wood and tar. They burn fast. Within minutes, the entire southern edge of Greenwood is an inferno. Dr. Jackson runs inside his hospital. He starts waking patients. Nurses are screaming. He can hear gunfire now. Hundreds of guns. Thousands. He looks out the window and sees them coming. A mob of white men. Not dozens. Thousands. They are carrying torches, carrying rifles, carrying rage. They are setting fire to every building. They are dragging black people out of their homes. He sees a woman running with a baby. A white man shoots her in the back. She falls. The baby rolls across the street. Another man picks up the baby and throws it into a burning building. Dr. Jackson grabs his medical bag. He is one of the best surgeons in America. The Mayo Clinic called him the most able Negro surgeon in the country. White people from across Oklahoma pay him top dollar because he is that good. He thinks maybe that will save him. He walks out the front door with his hands up. He is surrendering. He is a doctor. He is unarmed. A white police officer sees him. The officer raises his rifle. Dr. Jackson says, "I am not armed. I am a physician." The officer shoots him in the chest. Dr. Jackson falls. He bleeds out on the steps of his own hospital while it burns behind him. In the next 18 hours, 35 city blocks vanish. 300 black people are murdered. 10,000 are left homeless. $32 million in property is destroyed. That is $400 million in today's money. From one city, in one day. And for 75 years, it was not in a single Oklahoma textbook. Not one. 3 generations of children, black and white, grew up not knowing this happened. Your grandmother might have lived in Tulsa and never been taught that her mother's neighborhood was bombed by airplanes. Your grandfather might have walked past mass graves and never known they were there. This is your stolen inheritance. This is the wealth they burned, so you would stay poor forever. Now you might be thinking, how is that possible? How did they hide something that big? How did an entire massacre involving thousands of people and 6 airplanes just disappear from history? That is what we are going to break down. But first, you need to understand what Greenwood was before they destroyed it. Because they did not just burn buildings, they burned possibility. They burned the blueprint. They burned the evidence that black people could build wealth without white permission. And they had to erase it from history, because if you knew what your ancestors built, you would know what you are capable of building now. And that terrifies them. Let me take you back to 1906, 15 years before the massacre. Greenwood does not exist yet. Tulsa is a small oil town in Oklahoma Territory, not even a state yet. Black people live on the north side of the railroad tracks in an area white people call the colored section. It is not nice. It is not wealthy. It is dirt roads and small wooden shacks. Then a man named O.W. Gurley arrives. Gurley was born in 1868 in Alabama. His parents had been enslaved. He grew up during Reconstruction. He saw black people win elections. He saw black congressmen and senators. He saw what was possible when black people had power. Then he saw it all get torn down. He saw redemption governments take over. He saw Jim Crow laws get passed. He saw lynchings become common. He knew that political power without economic power was fragile. So he focused on economics. Gurley moved to Perry, Oklahoma, and worked for the government. He saved every penny. He watched white men get rich off oil and land speculation. He thought, why not me? In 1905, he bought 40 acres of land in Tulsa. 40 acres on the north side of the tracks. The white side nobody wanted. He paid cash. Then he did something brilliant. He put a deed restriction on the land. Only black people could buy property in his development. Every lot, every building, blacks only. He was creating an economic ecosystem, a place where every dollar would stay black, where every business would be black-owned, where every job would go to a black worker, where wealth would compound inside the community instead of leaking out to white businesses. White people thought he was crazy. They laughed at him. 40 acres in the colored section. Who would want that? But Gurley knew something they did not. He knew that black people across the South were desperate for opportunity, desperate for a place where they could own something, build something, be something. He knew that if he built it, they would come. And they did. In 1906, Gurley built the first structure, a 2-story rooming house. He called it Gurley Hotel. It was nice, really nice. 54 rooms, indoor plumbing, electric lights, furniture imported from Kansas City. It was nicer than most white hotels in Tulsa, and it was blacks only. Word spread. Black families started arriving, sharecroppers from Arkansas, laborers from Texas, teachers from Louisiana. They came because in Gurley's development, they could own land. They could start businesses. They could vote without being lynched. Oklahoma was still a territory not yet infected with the worst of Jim Crow. There was a window, a brief moment of possibility, and thousands of black people poured through it. By 1910, Gurley's 40 acres had over 100 families. By 1915, it had 500 businesses. By 1920, it had 11,000 residents and was the wealthiest black community in America. Let me give you the numbers because the numbers are staggering. Greenwood in 1921 had 615 businesses. Let me list some of them. 21 restaurants and cafes, 30 grocery stores, a dozen doctors' offices, 4 drugstores, 8 lawyers' offices, 6 dentists, 2 newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun, 2 theaters, Dreamland Theater and Renaissance Theater, 1 library, 1 hospital with 20 beds, 13 churches, 3 fraternal lodges, 2 private schools, a public school system with over 500 students, a roller skating rink, a couple of pool halls, 30 beauty salons and barbershops, 15 physicians, 5 hotels, 2 insurance agencies, 1 bank, and here is the number that should blow your mind. 6 privately owned airplanes. In 1920, black people in Greenwood owned personal airplanes. Think about that. Your great-great-grandparents might have owned an airplane before most white families owned a car. The total property value in Greenwood was $32 million in 1921. That is somewhere between 400 million and 600 million today, depending on how you calculate it. The average household income in Greenwood was $15,000 a year. That is 3 times the national average for black families at the time. Some families were making $30,000 to $40,000. That is millionaire status. And not just a few families. Over 300 families in Greenwood were millionaires. 300 in one neighborhood, in one city, in Oklahoma, 40 years after slavery ended. Let that sink in. 40 years from being property to owning millions in property. Your ancestors did that. Not with government help, not with white charity. They did it themselves through pure economic cooperation and determination. Now let me tell you about some of these millionaires, because they were not just rich, they were remarkable. Start with O.W. Gurley himself. By 1921, Gurley Hotel was the crown jewel of Greenwood, 54 rooms always booked. He also owned a grocery store, a rooming house, and several rental properties. His total wealth was estimated at $200,000 in 1921 money. That is 3 to 4 million today. He started with nothing. His parents had been slaves. He built an empire in 15 years. That is your legacy. That is your bloodline. That is the inheritance they stole. Then there was John Williams and his wife Lula. John owned Dreamland Theater, 750 seats, velvet curtains, a stage for live performances, a projection room for silent films. It was one of the finest theaters in Oklahoma, black or white. Dreamland hosted national acts, famous musicians, comedians, speakers. It was the cultural heart of Greenwood. John also owned Williams Confectionery, a candy shop and soda fountain that was always packed with kids. His wife Lula was a teacher and businesswoman who ran several rental properties. Together they were worth between $150,000 and $200,000. When the mob came, John tried to defend Dreamland. He stood on the roof with a rifle firing at the arsonists below. They shot him off the roof. He died in the streets. Dreamland burned to ashes. Lula survived but lost everything. She never received a dime of insurance money, not one dime. She spent the rest of her life fighting for reparations. She died poor. Then there was Dr. A.C. Jackson, the best surgeon in Oklahoma, possibly the best black surgeon in America. The Mayo brothers, you know the Mayo Clinic, they called him the most able Negro surgeon in America. He had a private practice that served black and white patients. White millionaires from Tulsa paid him top rates because he was that skilled. He owned a 20-bed hospital in Greenwood. He owned his home. He owned medical equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars. He was respected by everyone, black and white. On June 1st, when the mob came, Dr. Jackson walked out of his house with his hands raised. He was surrendering. He was unarmed. He was a doctor, for God's sake. They shot him anyway, multiple times. He bled out in his front yard. His hospital was burned. His equipment was looted. His wealth was erased. And for 75 years, most people did not even know his name. There was J.H. Goodwin. He owned the Tulsa Star, one of the 2 black newspapers in Greenwood. Goodwin was a trained lawyer. He used his paper to advocate for civil rights, to promote black businesses, to document the achievements of the community. His printing press was state-of-the-art. His office had years of archives, photographs, articles, records, proof of what Greenwood had accomplished. When the mob came, they targeted the Tulsa Star immediately. They smashed the press. They burned the archives. They destroyed every copy of every issue they could find. Why? Because the newspaper was evidence. It was proof that black people had built this, that it was real, that it was successful. They could not let that evidence survive. Goodwin tried to rebuild, but could not get the capital. Banks refused to lend to him. He lost everything. There was Mabel Little. She owned Mabel B. Little Beauty Salon. It was the finest salon in Tulsa. She served black women and white women. Yes, white women. Wealthy white women from South Tulsa would secretly come to Mabel's salon because she was the best. She had trained in Kansas City and Chicago. She knew techniques that white salons did not. She made good money. She owned her building. She employed 6 people. When the massacre happened, her salon was burned. But here is what they do not tell you. After the massacre, Mabel tried to rebuild. She had some savings hidden. She bought materials. She started construction. Then the city changed the zoning laws. They said her lot was now zoned residential only. No commercial businesses allowed. She could not rebuild her salon. She lost her livelihood. She had to leave Tulsa. That was not an accident. That was policy. That was how they made sure Greenwood never came back. I could go on. I could tell you about Simon Berry, who owned a jitney service with 12 cars. About Presley J. Warner, who owned a dry goods store. About Lula Thompson, who owned a cafeteria. About the Williams family, no relation to John Williams, who owned a rooming house and a confectionery. About the Hooker family, about the Jackson family, about the Smitherman family, about the Lockhart family. Over 300 millionaire families, doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, teachers, builders, all erased, all stolen, all forgotten, until now. But here is what you need to understand. It was not just the money, it was the model. Greenwood proved that black economic independence was possible. It proved that if you kept black dollars in black hands, wealth would compound. It proved that without white interference, black people could build thriving communities that rivaled anything white America had. And that was the threat. Not the money itself, the idea, the blueprint, the proof of concept. Because if Greenwood could do it, then every black community in America could do it. And if every black community did it, then the entire economic structure of white supremacy would collapse. Black people would not need white employers, would not need white banks, would not need white permission. They would be independent, truly free, economically free. And that could not be allowed. So they needed an excuse. They needed a reason to destroy it that would seem justified. And on May 30th, 1921, they got one. Or rather, they manufactured one. Let me tell you what really happened. May 30th, 1921. A 19-year-old black kid named Dick Rowland worked as a shoe shiner in downtown Tulsa. Dick was a good kid, polite, hard-working. He lived in Greenwood with his mother. Every day he walked to downtown Tulsa to shine shoes. The restroom for colored people was on the top floor of the Drexel building. To get there, you had to take an elevator. The elevator operator was a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. Dick and Sarah saw each other every day, every single day. Some historians believe they were friendly. Some believe they were secretly dating, which was absolutely forbidden under Jim Crow. We will never know for sure, because neither of them ever gave a full account of what happened next. May 30th around noon. Dick gets in the elevator. Sarah is operating it. Something happens. We do not know what. One account says Dick tripped getting into the elevator and grabbed Sarah's arm to steady himself. Another account says Dick stepped on Sarah's foot accidentally, and she screamed in surprise. Another account says they were having an argument about their secret relationship, and Sarah yelled at him. Whatever happened, Sarah screamed. A white clerk in the building heard the scream and saw Dick running out of the building. The clerk assumed the worst. He called the police and said a black man had assaulted a white woman in the elevator. That was all it took. In the South in 1921, a black man and a white woman and a scream meant one thing: rape. Even if no rape happened, even if no assault happened, even if it was a misunderstanding or an accident. None of that mattered. The Tulsa Tribune, the white newspaper, got word of it. They saw an opportunity. The Tribune had been publishing increasingly racist articles for months, stirring up resentment, warning that black people in Greenwood were getting too prosperous, too uppity, too independent. The editor, a man named Richard Lloyd Jones, hated Greenwood. He hated that black people were succeeding. He wanted them put back in their place. So when he heard about Dick Rowland and Sarah Page, he saw his chance. On May 31st, the Tribune published a front-page article with the headline "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." The article used the word assault. It implied sexual assault. It said Dick Rowland had attacked Sarah Page. And then, in an afternoon edition that has since mysteriously disappeared, the Tribune allegedly published an editorial with the headline, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." That editorial, if it existed, has never been found. Every copy of that edition vanished, but multiple witnesses remembered seeing it. Multiple witnesses remembered that headline, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." By evening, a white mob had gathered outside the Tulsa courthouse. Dick Rowland was being held inside. The mob numbered in the hundreds at first, then over 1,000, then over 2,000. They were chanting, shouting, demanding that the sheriff hand over Dick Rowland so they could lynch him. The sheriff, a man named Willard McCullough, refused. He locked the top floor and barricaded the elevator. He said he would protect Dick Rowland, but everyone knew that sheriffs in the South did not always keep that promise. Lynchings happened all the time. Sheriffs would look the other way, or they would actively participate. Black people in Greenwood heard about the mob. They heard the chants. They knew what was coming. They had seen it before. They had heard the stories from their parents and grandparents. They knew that if that mob got Dick Rowland, they would hang him from a tree and burn his body and take photographs and sell them as postcards. That is what happened to black men accused of even looking at white women wrong. It happened all the time. So a group of black men in Greenwood made a decision. They would not let it happen. Not this time. Not in their city. Around 9 p.m. 75, black men, many of them World War I veterans, armed themselves and drove to the courthouse. They were not a mob. They were disciplined. They were organized. They were veterans who had fought for America in France and Belgium. They knew how to handle weapons. They knew tactics. They marched up to the courthouse and offered their services to Sheriff McCullough. They said, "We are here to help you protect the prisoner. We will not let them lynch him." The sheriff told them to go home. He said he had it under control. The black men did not believe him. They stayed. The white mob saw them, saw 75 armed black men, and they were shocked. In their minds, black people did not carry guns. Black people did not stand up to whites. Black people certainly did not come armed to confront a white mob. This was unthinkable. This was uppity. This was exactly the kind of behavior that Greenwood prosperity had created. Black people who thought they were equal, who acted like they had rights, who refused to submit. The white mob grew angrier. More white men arrived. The crowd swelled to over 2,000. Someone in the crowd, a white man, approached one of the black veterans and tried to take his rifle. They struggled. The gun went off. A white man fell dead. And that was it. That was the spark. Both sides opened fire. The black veterans were outnumbered 30 to 1, but they were better trained. They fired in disciplined volleys. They took cover. They retreated in formation back toward Greenwood. They killed at least a dozen white men in that first exchange, and that enraged the white mob even more. Black men had killed whites. Black men had shot back. Black men had defended themselves. That could not stand. That could not be tolerated. That had to be punished, severely, permanently, publicly. The white mob did not chase the black veterans immediately. Instead, they regrouped. They went to hardware stores and pawn shops. The owners opened up and handed out guns and ammunition. For free, they armed the mob. The police did not stop them. The police joined them. Police officers started deputizing white men, giving them badges, making them official. By midnight, thousands of white men were armed and organized and ready to invade Greenwood. But they did not just want to arrest the men who had shot at them. They wanted to destroy Greenwood entirely. They wanted to burn the whole thing down. They wanted to make an example, a lesson, a warning to every black community in America. This is what happens when you get too successful. This is what happens when you forget your place. This is what happens when you fight back. Around 1 a.m. on June 1st, the invasion began. Thousands of white men poured across the Frisco Railroad tracks into Greenwood. They were not soldiers. They were a mob. But they were armed like soldiers. They had rifles, shotguns, pistols. They moved in groups. They went house to house, kicking in doors, dragging people out, shooting anyone who resisted, setting fires, looting. Some of them were laughing. Some of them were taking photographs. Some of them stopped to pose with the black people they had shot, like hunters with deer. They piled black bodies in the streets. They threw kerosene on them and lit them on fire. They shot people trying to run. They shot women holding babies. They shot old men and old women. They did not care. This was not war. This was extermination. This was erasure. By 5 a.m., the southern part of Greenwood was burning, but it was spreading too slowly. The buildings were brick. They did not catch fire easily. So someone had an idea. Use airplanes. There were several privately owned planes in Tulsa. Crop dusters, joyriding planes. The mob requisitioned them. Pilots volunteered. They loaded the planes with homemade bombs, bottles filled with gasoline and turpentine. They took off just before dawn. 6 planes total. They flew low over Greenwood, low enough that people on the ground could see the pilots' faces. Some of the pilots were waving. They dropped their bombs on the roofs. The bombs exploded on impact. Roofs caught fire. The fires spread. Within an hour, entire blocks were engulfed. The bombs were not sophisticated. They were just bottles of gasoline with rags stuffed in them. But they worked. They turned Greenwood into an inferno. This was the first time in American history that airplanes were used to bomb American citizens on American soil. The first time, not in war, not against a foreign enemy, against Americans, black Americans, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and nobody stopped it. The police did not stop it. The National Guard did not stop it. They participated. By 8 a.m., over 500 National Guard troops had arrived in Tulsa. Their orders were to restore order. Instead, they helped the mob. They rounded up black people at gunpoint. They marched them to detention centers. They looted homes alongside the mob. They shot black people who tried to defend their property. The National Guard, a government military force, participated in a massacre of American citizens. By noon, Greenwood was gone. 35 city blocks completely destroyed. 1,200 homes burned. 600 businesses burned. Every church burned. Every school burned. The hospital burned. The library burned. Dreamland Theater burned. Gurley Hotel burned. The Tulsa Star office burned. Everything. Ashes, smoke, rubble. The only thing left standing were a few brick shells, empty facades, skeletons of buildings with the roofs caved in and the windows blown out. 10,000 black people were homeless. Homeless in their own city, the city they had built. The wealth they had created, gone in 18 hours. And the bodies. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly, because nobody counted. not officially. The official count from the city of Tulsa was 36 dead. 36. That is a lie. Witnesses reported seeing trucks loaded with black bodies driving to mass burial sites. Witnesses reported seeing bodies thrown into the Arkansas River. Witnesses reported seeing bodies burned in furnaces. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 150 to 300. Some historians believe it could be as high as 500. We will never know the exact number because they hid the bodies. They buried them in unmarked mass graves. They threw them in the river. They burned them. They made them disappear. And for decades, the city of Tulsa denied those mass graves even existed. Until 1997, 76 years later. A historian named Scott Ellsworth started investigating. He interviewed survivors. He looked at old maps. He studied aerial photographs from 1921. He found evidence of mass graves, 3 sites, one at Oaklawn Cemetery, one at New Block Park, one at Rolling Oaks Memorial Gardens. In 2001, the state of Oklahoma formed a commission to investigate. They used ground-penetrating radar. They found anomalies, disturbances in the soil consistent with mass burials. But they did not excavate. They did not dig them up. They just confirmed they were there, and then stopped. Why? Because opening those graves would mean acknowledging the real death toll. It would mean admitting the city lied for 75 years. It would mean lawsuits, reparations, accountability. In 2020, they finally started excavating. 99 years later, they found remains, dozens of bodies, buried in trenches, no coffins, no markers, just bodies stacked on top of each other. Some showed signs of gunshot trauma. Some showed signs of blunt force trauma. Some were burned. These were not people who died peacefully. These were murder victims, and they are still finding them. As I record this in 2025, they are still digging, still finding bodies, still uncovering the evidence that Tulsa tried to bury forever. Your ancestors are in those graves. Your great-great-grandparents, your great-great-aunts and uncles. They were millionaires. They were doctors and lawyers and business owners. And they were murdered and thrown in unmarked holes in the ground like trash. And nobody was punished. Nobody went to jail. Nobody was even arrested. In fact, the only people arrested were black people. 27 black men were charged with inciting a riot. Inciting. They were the ones charged. Not the white mob that burned 35 blocks. Not the police who participated. Not the National Guard soldiers who shot civilians. Not the airplane pilots who dropped bombs. The victims were charged with causing their own massacre. Every single charge was eventually dropped because even the racist courts knew it would not hold up. But the message was sent. If you defend yourself, if you fight back, if you protect your community, you will be blamed. You will be punished. You will be erased. Now let me tell you about the cover-up. Because the cover-up is almost as evil as the massacre itself. Within hours of the burning Tulsa city, officials began destroying evidence. Property records went missing. The original deeds showing who owned what in Greenwood disappeared from the courthouse. Insurance records vanished. Photographs were confiscated. The Tulsa Tribune, the newspaper that had published the lynch mob headline, pulled that entire edition from their archives. To this day, nobody has found a copy. It is gone. Erased. The newspaper claimed it never existed. Survivors said it did. Who do you believe? The city commissioned a report. The grand jury report of June 25, 1921. It blamed black people. It said the massacre started because armed Negroes marched on the courthouse. It said black people fired first. It said black people burned their own neighborhood. Yes, The report actually claimed that black people burned down their own million-dollar businesses and their own homes to frame white people. That is how absurd the official story was. And that absurd story became the official history for 75 years. That is what was taught in schools. That is what was printed in textbooks. Tulsa Race Riot, started by Negroes. Both sides equally to blame. Property damage was unfortunate but unavoidable. Move along, nothing to see here. Meanwhile, the survivors were left with nothing. They tried to file insurance claims. Every single claim was denied. Why? Because insurance policies had a riot exclusion clause. If your property was destroyed in a riot, insurance did not cover it. So the insurance companies said, "Sorry, this was a riot. We do not have to pay you." But if it was a riot, then both sides were equally violent, which means the white mob was rioting too, which means they committed crimes, which means they should be prosecuted. But nobody was prosecuted. So which was it? Was it a riot where both sides were guilty? Or was it a massacre where one side was the aggressor? The city played both sides. It called it a riot to deny insurance claims, but it called it a Negro uprising to justify the white violence. They had it both ways, and black families got nothing. Some families tried to rebuild. They had a little money saved. They bought materials. They started construction. Then the city changed the laws. In June 1921, just days after the massacre, the Tulsa City Commission passed a fire ordinance. It required all new buildings in the burned area to be constructed of fireproof materials, brick or concrete, no wood. Sounds reasonable, right? Except brick and concrete buildings cost $15,000 minimum. $15,000 in 1921. That is $200,000 today. How many families who just lost everything had $200,000 lying around? None. That was the point. The fire ordinance was designed to prevent rebuilding, to make sure Greenwood stayed dead, but some families tried anyway. They pooled money. They took loans from black banks in other cities. They started rebuilding. Then the city announced a new plan. They were going to use eminent domain to seize the land. They said they needed it for a railroad depot, a public project. The government can seize private land for public use. It is in the Constitution. So the city announced they were taking the land. They would pay fair market value. But what is fair market value for land that just got burned? Nothing. The land was worthless now. So the city offered pennies on the dollar. Most families refused to sell. So the city just took it anyway. They bulldozed the remaining structures. They cleared the land. And then here is the kicker. They never built the railroad depot. It was a lie. The depot was never built. They just wanted the land cleared. They wanted to make sure Greenwood never came back. And for a while, it worked. But black people in Tulsa were resilient. Some families refused to leave. They camped in tents on their old property. They lived in Red Cross shelters. They endured the winter. And slowly, painfully, they started to rebuild. Not to the same scale, not with the same wealth, but they rebuilt something. By 1925, there were a few businesses operating again. By 1930, there was a small commercial district. By 1940, Greenwood had partially recovered. It never reached the heights of 1921. It never had 300 millionaires again, but it survived. It existed. Black Tulsans made sure of that. They refused to let the massacre be the end of the story, but white Tulsa made sure the massacre was erased from the story. From 1921 to 1996, 75 years, the Tulsa Race Massacre was not taught in Oklahoma schools, not mentioned in textbooks, not discussed in public. There was a collective agreement to forget. White people wanted to forget because it made them look bad. Black people were forced to forget because talking about it was dangerous. Survivors who spoke up were threatened. Some lost their jobs. Some had to leave town. So most stayed silent. They told their children in whispers. They passed down the stories in private. But publicly, officially, it did not happen. An entire generation of Tulsans, black and white, grew up not knowing. Their grandparents had lived through a massacre, and they had no idea. Historians tried to research it and hit walls. Archives were incomplete. Records were missing. Newspapers from that week were gone. The Tribune archives had a gap, May 31st and June 1st, 1921. Just missing. Accidentally destroyed, they said. Sure, an entire week of newspapers from the most significant event in Tulsa history just happened to get lost. Nobody believed that. But there was no proof, no smoking gun, just suspicious gaps. So the story stayed buried until the survivors started dying. And before they died, some of them decided to speak, to break the silence, to tell the truth before it was too late. In the 1990s, a few survivors gave interviews. Olivia Hooker. She was 6 years old during the massacre. She remembered white men breaking into her house. She remembered them smashing her sister's doll. She remembered hiding under a table while they poured oil on the furniture and set it on fire. She remembered running. She lived to be 103. Before she died in 2018, she told her story dozens of times. She made sure people knew. George Monroe remembered watching his father get shot in front of him. He was 5 years old. He remembered the white mob laughing as his father fell. He remembered his mother screaming. He remembered running through smoke and fire. He told his story. Eldoris Makundichi remembered the airplanes. She was 5. She remembered looking up and seeing planes flying low. She remembered the bombs falling. She remembered the explosions. She told her story. In 1996, 75 years after the massacre, the Oklahoma legislature finally acknowledged it happened. They formed the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. Not massacre, riot. Still using that word. The commission spent 5 years investigating. They interviewed survivors. They reviewed documents. They excavated test sites. In 2001, they published a report. It confirmed everything the survivors had said. The white mob, the police participation, the National Guard involvement, the airplanes, the mass graves, all of it. The report recommended reparations, direct payments to survivors, a scholarship fund for descendants, economic development in Greenwood. The Oklahoma legislature read the report, acknowledged it, thanked the commission, and did nothing. No reparations, no payments, no scholarships, nothing. They admitted it happened and then refused to do anything about it. The survivors sued. In 2020, Leslie Benningfield, Randall Viola Fletcher, and Hughes Van Ellis, 3 of the last living survivors, filed a lawsuit. They were over 100 years old. Leslie was 107. Viola was 107. Hughes was 100. They had waited their entire lives for justice. They demanded reparations. They demanded compensation for what was stolen. They demanded acknowledgement. The case went to court. In 2023, the Oklahoma Supreme Court dismissed it. They said too much time had passed. The statute of limitations had expired. You cannot sue for something that happened over 100 years ago, they said. Never mind that the cover-up lasted 75 years. Never mind that survivors were threatened into silence. Never mind that the city actively destroyed evidence. Too late, the court said. Sorry. Case dismissed. Viola Fletcher died in 2024 at 110 years old. She never got justice. She never got a dime. She spent 110 years living with the trauma of watching her home burn, of watching her neighbors die, of losing everything her parents had built. And America told her, sorry you waited too long. Hughes Van Ellis died in 2024 at 102. Same story. Never compensated. Never acknowledged. Leslie Benningfield Randall is still alive as I record this. She is 108 years old. She is still fighting, still demanding what is owed. But the courts say no. The politicians say no. White America says no. Now you might be thinking, okay, this is terrible, but it was one city, one massacre. Horrible, yes, but isolated. Wrong. Tulsa was not isolated. Tulsa was part of a pattern, a system, a strategy. Every time black people built wealth, white supremacy destroyed it. Every time. Let me show you the pattern, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And you will understand that what happened to your family was not bad luck. It was not poor choices. It was not lack of effort. It was theft. Systematic, intentional, repeated theft. Let me take you to Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, 23 years before Tulsa. Wilmington was the largest city in North Carolina. It had a majority black population, and those black people were thriving. They owned businesses. They held political office. The city government was integrated. Black aldermen, black police officers, black magistrates. The district attorney was white, but he was a Republican who supported black rights. The city was doing well, economically prosperous, socially progressive for the time, and white supremacists hated it. They called it Negro rule. They said black people were unfit to govern. They said it was an abomination. So they decided to fix it. With violence. November 10th, 1898. 2,000 armed white men, led by a former Confederate colonel named Alfred Moore Waddell, staged a coup. A coup. They overthrew the elected government. They forced the mayor to resign at gunpoint. They forced the aldermen to resign. They installed their own government. All white. They went to the office of the Daily Record, the black-owned newspaper. The editor was Alex Manley. He had written an editorial challenging the myth that black men were raping white women. He pointed out that many of these so-called rapes were consensual relationships that white women later denied to avoid scandal. That editorial enraged white men. So on November 10th, Waddell's mob burned the Daily Record office to the ground. Then they went through the black neighborhoods, shooting people. They killed at least 60. Some estimates say 300. Nobody knows for sure because they hid the bodies. They threw them in the Cape Fear River. They buried them in unmarked graves. They terrorized the entire black community. Then they banished the black leaders, forced them onto trains and told them never to come back. They confiscated property. They stole businesses. And they got away with it. This was the only successful coup d'etat in American history. The only time an elected government was violently overthrown and replaced. And it was done to destroy black political and economic power. The federal government did nothing. President McKinley did nothing. Congress did nothing. The white supremacists won. And Wilmington went from a majority black city with black political power to a white-controlled city with black people completely disenfranchised. And it stayed that way for 70 years. 70 years. That is what happens when black people get too successful. They overthrow the government and steal everything, and nobody stops them. Let me take you to Rosewood, Florida, 1923, 2 years after Tulsa. Rosewood was a small town, mostly black, about 300 residents. They owned land, they had businesses, a general store, a church, a school, a Masonic hall. They lived peacefully next to a white town called Sumner. The towns coexisted for years. Then January 1st, 1923, a white woman in Sumner named Fannie Taylor claimed a black man attacked her. She was lying. She had been having an affair with a white man who was not her husband. Her husband came home unexpectedly. She needed an excuse for why she looked disheveled. So she screamed and said a black man attacked her. That lie cost over 100 lives. White men from Sumner and surrounding towns formed a mob. They went to Rosewood hunting for the supposed attacker. They did not find him. So they started killing random black people. They lynched a man named Sam Carter. They shot a woman named Sarah Carrier in her own home. They set houses on fire. Black families fled into the swamps. They hid for days in freezing water. The white mob burned every building in Rosewood, every single one. The town ceased to exist. At least 8 people were confirmed dead. The real number is probably much higher. Survivors said dozens died in the swamps. Bodies were never recovered. The white mob hunted them like animals. And when it was over, Rosewood was gone, erased from the map. The land was seized. The property was taken. The survivors never came back. They scattered across Florida and beyond. And for 70 years, Florida did not acknowledge it happened. In 1994, 71 years later, Florida finally passed a law compensating survivors. 9 survivors were still alive. They each received $150,000. That is it. $150,000 for losing everything, for watching their families murdered, for being hunted through swamps, for 70 years of silence and trauma. And the descendants got nothing. Not a penny. The state said sorry reparations only for direct survivors. Your parents lost everything, but you get nothing. That is Florida's idea of justice. Let me take you to Elaine, Arkansas. 1919, 2 years before Tulsa. Phillips County, Arkansas was majority black. Most were sharecroppers. They worked the land, but white landowners took most of the profit. The sharecroppers were paid almost nothing. They were in debt to the landowners. It was slavery by another name. So in 1919, black sharecroppers formed a union, the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. They wanted fair wages. They wanted honest accounting. They wanted to be able to sell their cotton at market prices instead of being forced to sell to the landowner at whatever price he decided. Reasonable demands, economic justice. White landowners saw it as insurrection. September 30th, 1919. The Union held a meeting at a church in Hoop Spur. About 100 black farmers attended. They were armed because they knew white people might attack. Sure enough, white men showed up and started shooting into the church. The black farmers shot back. 1 white man was killed. That was all the excuse they needed. The next day, white mobs from Arkansas and Mississippi poured into Phillips County. They were hunting black people, shooting them on sight. They went into the fields and shot sharecroppers. They went into homes and shot families. The governor called in federal troops, 500 soldiers. They arrested over 1,000 black people. They held them in stockades, treated them like prisoners of war. They did not arrest a single white person. The death toll is unknown. Official records say 5 whites and 25 blacks. That is a lie. Witnesses reported seeing trains loaded with black bodies. Estimates range from 100 to 240 dead, all black. The soldiers and the mobs terrorized the black population for weeks. Then they put 12 black men on trial for murder, convicted them in minutes, sentenced them to death. The trials were a farce. All white juries, no real defense, guilty verdicts before the trial even started. Those 12 men sat on death row for years until the NAACP fought their cases all the way to the Supreme Court. The court overturned the convictions, but the message was sent. Organize for fair wages, and we will kill you. Form a union, and we will hunt you. Demand economic justice, and we will exterminate you. Let me take you to Atlanta, Georgia, 1906, 15 years before Tulsa. Atlanta had a thriving black community, 6 black colleges and universities, a black business district on Auburn Avenue, black doctors, lawyers, businessmen, prosperity, progress. White supremacists hated it, so they manufactured a crisis. In September 1906, Atlanta newspapers published false reports of black men attacking white women. 4 alleged attacks in 1 week, all lies or gross exaggerations. But the newspapers whipped white people into a frenzy. On September 22nd, a white mob formed downtown, 10,000 people. They went through Atlanta attacking any black person they saw. They dragged people off streetcars and beat them to death. They attacked black businesses. They set fires. They lynched people from lampposts. The violence lasted 4 days. At least 25 black people were killed. Probably more. Hundreds injured. Black neighborhoods were terrorized. And when it was over, Atlanta passed more Jim Crow laws, more segregation, more restrictions, punishing the victims, rewarding the mob. Let me take you to Ocoee, Florida. 1920, 1 year before Tulsa, November 2nd, 1920, Election Day. A black man named Mose Norman tried to vote in Ocoee. He was turned away because he had not paid his poll tax. Poll taxes were designed to keep black people from voting. Mose left and came back with his poll tax receipt. They still refused to let him vote. He left again and got a lawyer. They still refused. White men in town were furious. How dare a black man be so uppity? How dare he demand his right to vote? That night, the Ku Klux Klan came to Ocoee looking for Mose. He was hiding. So they went to the home of Julius July Perry, another black man who had tried to vote. July defended his home. He shot 2 Klansmen. They shot back. They dragged July out and lynched him. Then they burned his house. Then they burned every black home in Ocoee. The entire black community, about 500 people, fled. They never came back. Ocoee became an all-white town. It stayed that way for decades, a sundown town. No black people allowed after dark, and it all started because one man tried to vote. Do you see the pattern now? Wilmington, 1898. Atlanta, 1906. Elaine, 1919. Ocoee, 1920. Tulsa, 1921. Rosewood, 1923. And those are just the ones we know about. The ones that were big enough that they could not be completely erased. There were dozens more. Small massacres, lynchings, burnings, property seizures. Every time black people built something, white supremacy burned it down. Every time black people organized for economic power, they were massacred. Every time black people demanded political rights, they were terrorized. This was not random. This was not a series of unfortunate events. This was policy. This was strategy. This was systematic destruction of black economic and political power. And here is the key. After each massacre, the same pattern followed. Destroy the evidence, blame the victims, change the laws to prevent rebuilding, and erase it from history, every single time. In Tulsa, they burned property records. In Wilmington, they rewrote history books to call the coup a restoration of good government. In Rosewood, they let the town disappear from maps. In Elaine, they buried the bodies in unmarked graves. In Atlanta, they called it a race riot, implying both sides were equally guilty. In Ocoee, they simply never spoke of it again. The formula was always the same. Massacre, cover up, erase, move on. And then wonder why black people do not have generational wealth. Let me show you how they did the cover-up. Because understanding the mechanism of erasure is just as important as understanding the massacre itself. They did not just burn buildings, they burned history. They did not just kill people, they killed memory, and they did it so thoroughly that 3 generations grew up not knowing. Your grandmother might have walked past a mass grave in Tulsa and had no idea. Your grandfather might have lived in a neighborhood that used to be thriving Black Wall Street and never been told. The erasure was deliberate, it was systematic, and it worked for 75 years. Start with physical destruction of evidence. The moment the massacre ended, Tulsa city officials began destroying records. Property deeds disappeared from the courthouse. These were legal documents proving who owned what in Greenwood. Without those deeds, survivors could not prove they owned property, could not file insurance claims, could not fight eminent domain seizures. The deeds just vanished. City officials said they were lost in the chaos, but somehow only the deeds for Black-owned property went missing. White property deeds were fine, convenient. The Sanborn fire insurance maps were altered. Sanborn maps were detailed surveys showing every building in a city. They showed the owner's name, the building materials, the lot size, everything. Insurance companies used them to assess risk. After the massacre, someone went through the Sanborn maps for Greenwood and erased names, changed ownership records, made it look like the property had always been abandoned or vacant. Why so insurance companies could deny claims? If the map says the building was vacant, then nobody can claim they lost a business there. The original maps still exist in some archives. You can see where names were scratched out, where ownership was erased. It is evidence of a cover-up in real time. Photographs were confiscated. White people took lots of photographs during the massacre. They posed with dead bodies. They posed in front of burning buildings. They smiled. They sent the photos to each other as souvenirs. But after the massacre, when people started asking questions, those photographs became evidence of crimes. So officials went door to door collecting them. They told people to hand over any photos from June 1st. They said it was for the investigation. It was not. It was to destroy evidence. Most photos were burned. A few survived because people hid them. Those photos are the only visual record we have, and they are horrifying. Bodies in the street, buildings in flames, white men grinning next to corpses. That is what they tried to hide. The Tulsa Tribune archives were purged. The Tribune published the inflammatory headlines that sparked the massacre. To lynch Negro tonight. After the massacre that became a problem. That headline made the Tribune liable. It proved they incited violence. So the Tribune pulled every copy of that edition from their archives. They claimed it never existed. But dozens of people remembered seeing it, remembered reading it. The headline is referenced in contemporaneous accounts. But the physical evidence is gone. To this day, nobody has found a copy. The Tribune made sure of that. And when historians tried to access Tribune archives for May and June 1921, they found gaps, entire weeks missing. The newspaper claimed it was an accident. Files got misplaced over the years. Sure, the most important week in Tulsa history just happened to get lost. Insurance records vanished. After the massacre, Black property owners filed insurance claims. They had policies. They had paid premiums. Their homes and businesses were insured. The insurance companies denied every single claim. Why riot exclusion clause? Insurance does not cover damage from riots. But this was not a riot. This was a massacre. One-sided violence, terrorism. The insurance companies said sorry, the grand jury called it a riot, so we do not pay. When survivors tried to fight this in court, they needed documentation. They needed their policies. They needed proof of what they owned. Those documents were gone. Insurance company files were destroyed. Accidentally, they said, water damage, misfire, misplacement. Always an excuse, always an accident, never any accountability. Now let us talk about legal suppression. The grand jury report was a masterpiece of blame shifting. On June 25, 1921, less than a month after the massacre, a grand jury issued a report on what happened. The report blamed black people. It said armed Negroes assembled at the courthouse and started the conflict. It said black people were equally responsible for the violence. It recommended no prosecutions of white people. Zero. But it did recommend prosecuting black people for inciting a riot. The report became the official narrative. It was cited in legal cases for decades. It was used to deny reparations. It was used to justify insurance denials. It was legal cover for genocide. The Oklahoma Riot Indemnity Law was passed in 1921. This law said cities were not liable for damages caused by riots. It was passed specifically to protect Tulsa from lawsuits. Survivors tried to sue the city for failing to protect them, for participating in the violence. The city said sorry. State law says we are not liable. The law was passed after the massacre, but applied retroactively. That means it covered actions that happened before the law existed. That is unusual. That is suspicious. That is evidence of a cover-up at the state level. Courts blocked every attempt at justice. Survivors filed lawsuits immediately. They sued the city. They sued insurance companies. They sued individuals who destroyed their property. Every case was dismissed. Judges ruled against them. Juries, all white, found for the defendants. The legal system protected the perpetrators and punished the victims. One case made it all the way to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. The court ruled that Tulsa had no liability because the destruction was caused by rioters, not by the city's failure to protect its citizens. Never mind that the police participated. Never mind that the National Guard helped. Never mind that city officials deputized the mob. Not our fault, the court said. Blame the rioters. But do not prosecute the rioters either. Just leave everyone alone and forget it happened. Zoning laws were weaponized to prevent rebuilding. In June 1921, immediately after the massacre, Tulsa passed a fire ordinance. All buildings in the burned district had to be fireproof, brick or concrete. No wood. Minimum cost $15,000 per building. This priced out most survivors. They had just lost everything. Where would they get $15,000? The ordinance was designed to keep them from rebuilding. Then the city announced plans to seize the land through eminent domain. They said they needed it for a railroad depot and an industrial zone. Public projects, legal seizure. Survivors had no choice. The city offered pennies on the dollar. Most refused. The city took the land anyway. Then years later they quietly abandoned the railroad depot plan. It was never built. The land sat empty for decades. It was a lie, a scheme to steal land, and it worked. Now let us talk about educational erasure. This is where it gets truly insidious. From 1921 to 1996, 75 years, the Tulsa Race Massacre was not taught in Oklahoma schools. Not in history class, not in civics, not anywhere. It was completely omitted from the curriculum. Textbooks did not mention it. Teachers did not discuss it. Students graduated high school without knowing their city had experienced the worst incident of racial violence in American history. 3 generations. 75 years of children growing up ignorant of their own history. Why? Because state education officials decided it was too controversial. They said teaching about the massacre would inflame racial tensions, would make white students feel guilty, would make black students angry. So the solution was silence. Pretend it never happened. Teach about World War I. Teach about the Roaring Twenties. Teach about the Great Depression. But skip right over June 1st, 1921. Just a blank spot in the timeline. Nothing to see here. Teachers who tried to teach it were reprimanded. In the 1960s and 70s, a few teachers, black and white, tried to include the massacre in their lessons. They were told to stop. Administrators said it was not in the curriculum. Parents complained. School boards intervened. Some teachers were fired. The message was clear. Do not talk about this. Do not ask questions. Do not make trouble. So most teachers stayed silent. They taught what they were told to teach, and the truth stayed buried. The language was changed to minimize it. When the massacre was mentioned at all, it was called the Tulsa Race Riot. Not massacre. Riot. That word matters. A riot implies chaos, implies both sides fighting, implies equal blame. A massacre is one-sided. A massacre is murder. A massacre requires accountability. By calling it a riot, they made it sound like an unfortunate outbreak of violence, rather than a planned attack. They made it sound like something that just happened, rather than something that was done to people. The word riot erases the perpetrators. The word massacre names them. Even the date was obscured. Most historical references said late May or early June 1921. Not June 1st. Not a specific date. Why? Because specificity creates accountability. If you say June 1st, 1921, then you can look up what happened that day. You can find records. You can identify people. You can assign blame. But if you say late spring 1921, it is vague. It is fuzzy. It is easier to dismiss as legend or exaggeration. The vagueness was intentional. Survivor testimonies were dismissed as unreliable. When survivors tried to tell their stories, white historians said, well, they were children at the time. Their memories are not accurate. They are exaggerating. They are traumatized, so they remember it worse than it was. Never mind that dozens of survivors told consistent stories. Never mind that their accounts matched documentary evidence. Never mind that they were eyewitnesses. White historians said, we need more evidence. We need documentation. But the documentation was destroyed. So the survivors were caught in a trap. The evidence was gone. And without evidence, their testimony did not count. Convenient. Universities avoided researching it. For decades, historians at the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University did not study the massacre. It was not considered a legitimate topic. Graduate students who proposed dissertations on it were discouraged, told to pick something else, something less controversial, something that would not upset donors or legislators. Academic institutions participated in the erasure by refusing to investigate, by treating it as a taboo subject, by silencing scholars who wanted to uncover the truth. The Tulsa Historical Society did not include it in exhibits. If you visited the Tulsa Historical Society in the 1970s or 80s, you would see exhibits about oil barons, about early aviation, about Route 66, about the golden age of Tulsa, but nothing about the massacre. The Historical Society curates a version of Tulsa history that erased black people entirely. They presented Tulsa as a success story, a boomtown, a city of opportunity. They just left out the part where the city murdered 300 of its black residents and burned their neighborhood to the ground. Now let us talk about media manipulation. The way newspapers covered the massacre reveals the propaganda machine at work. In the immediate aftermath, national newspapers picked up the story. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune. They all reported on it, but the framing was telling. Headlines said whites shoot Negroes in Tulsa riot, not white mob massacres black neighborhood, not Tulsa police participate in racial terrorism. The language made it sound mutual. made it sound like both sides were fighting, made it sound like an unfortunate conflict rather than a planned attack. The articles emphasized property damage over loss of life. They talked about how many buildings burned, how much the damage cost. They mentioned the death toll almost as an afterthought, and they always used the low official number, 36 dead, never the real number, never the 300 bodies in mass graves. The focus on property damage made it seem like an economic issue rather than a human rights atrocity, made it easier to minimize. Articles quoted white officials exclusively, police chiefs, the mayor, the governor, business leaders, all white, all giving the same story. The Negroes started it. The Negroes were armed. The Negroes fired first. We had to restore order. Black voices were absent. Black survivors were not quoted. Black leaders were not interviewed. The narrative was controlled entirely by white authorities, and that narrative became history. Within weeks, national coverage stopped. By July 1921, the massacre was no longer news. It disappeared from newspapers. Why? Because white America did not want to keep talking about it. It was embarrassing. It contradicted the narrative of American progress. It revealed the brutality of white supremacy at a time when America was trying to present itself as a beacon of democracy. So the media moved on, found other stories, let Tulsa fade from memory. And for decades, if you were not from Tulsa, you probably never heard about it. Local Tulsa media enforced silence. The Tulsa Tribune, which had incited the massacre, never apologized, never acknowledged its role, never published a follow-up investigation. Instead, it published stories about rebuilding, about moving forward, about forgetting the past. The Tulsa World, the other major newspaper, did the same. Both papers participated in a collective amnesia. They wrote about Tulsa as if June 1st had never happened, as if 35 blocks had never burned, as if 300 people had never died. And their readers, especially white readers, were happy to forget. Black newspapers tried to tell the truth. The Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Pittsburgh Courier. These black newspapers published survivor accounts, published the real death tolls, published photographs. But black newspapers had limited circulation. They reached black communities, but not white communities. So the truth was known in Black America, but hidden from white America. Two separate realities, two separate histories, and the white version became the official version. Television and film ignored it completely. For 80 years, no major documentary, no Hollywood film, no TV special, nothing. The massacre was not deemed important enough, or interesting enough, or marketable enough to put on screen. Compare that to other historical events. Pearl Harbor has been depicted dozens of times. D-Day, the Civil War, the Old West, all dramatized repeatedly. But the Tulsa Massacre silence, until 2019, when the HBO series Watchmen featured it in the opening scene. That was the first time most Americans, black or white, saw a dramatization of what happened. 98 years later, that Watchmen scene shocked people. White viewers said, "I had no idea this happened." "Is this real?" Black viewers said. "Why did nobody tell us? Why did we have to learn about this from a superhero show?" The reaction proved how successful the erasure had been. An event involving thousands of people, 6 airplanes, and 300 deaths had been so thoroughly buried that a TV show in 2019 felt like a revelation. That is not an accident. That is a propaganda victory. That is what happens when you control the narrative for a century. Now let me connect this to today. Because you might be thinking, okay, this is terrible, but it was 100 years ago. What does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with my life right now? Everything. It has everything to do with you. The wealth gap you see today, is a direct result of massacres like Tulsa. The poverty in black communities is a direct result of stolen property. The lack of generational wealth is a direct result of destroyed businesses. This is not ancient history. This is the foundation of your current economic reality. Let me show you the math. The median white household in America in 2024 has a net worth of $188,200. The median black household has a net worth of $24,100. That is a ratio of almost 8 to 1. White families have 8 times the wealth of black families. 8 times. Why? Because of compound interest, because of generational transfer, because of inheritance. White families have been accumulating wealth for generations, buying homes, starting businesses, investing, passing it down. Black families had that same accumulation stolen, burned, seized, erased. Let me show you what Tulsa alone cost. $32 million destroyed in 1921. If that wealth had been preserved and grown at a conservative 4% annual return, do you know what it would be worth today? $1.2 billion. That is from one neighborhood in one city. Now multiply that by every massacre, every seizure, every redlining district, every urban renewal project that bulldozed black neighborhoods. The total stolen wealth is estimated at over $100 trillion. 100 trillion. With a T. That is not a metaphor. That is not exaggeration. That is an actual economic calculation done by economists who study the racial wealth gap. But it is not just about money in the past. It is about opportunity denied in the present. Here is how generational wealth works. Your white neighbor's grandparents bought a house in 1950. Let us say it cost $10,000. By 2000, that house was worth $200,000. They sold it, gave the money to their kids. Their kids used that money as a down payment on a bigger house. Plus, they paid for college. No student loans. Their kids, your neighbor, inherited that house, sold it for $400,000. Used that money to start a business, send their own kids to college, invest in retirement. That is how wealth compounds. That is generational transfer. Now here is what happened to black families. Your great-grandparents in Tulsa owned property worth $50,000 in 1921 money. It was burned. They got zero compensation. Zero. They had to start over with nothing. They could not buy a house because of redlining. Banks would not lend to black people in most neighborhoods. So they rented. Renting builds no equity, no wealth. They worked their whole lives and had nothing to pass down. Your grandparents started from zero. They also could not get loans, also had to rent, also built no equity. Your parents started from zero. Maybe they finally bought a house in the 1980s or 90s after redlining was illegal, but they paid higher interest rates. They bought in neighborhoods that did not appreciate as much, and they are still paying it off. So they have nothing to give you. You start from zero. Or worse, you start from negative because you have student loans. That is the math. That is why the wealth gap exists. Not because black people do not work hard. Not because black people do not save money. Not because black people make bad choices. Because the wealth was stolen, and it was never returned. And it continues to compound in the wrong direction. Every generation the gap gets wider, because white families keep passing wealth down, and black families keep starting from zero.